I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hi everyone, welcome to VLGA Connect. It's the weekly TGU panel discussion on all things local government, mostly in Victoria, but we do tend to stray and digress just a little. We can't help it. We're all local government tragics here. Tony Raunic, hello.
G'day, Chris.
And Julie Reid, hello.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Tony.
You're both looking particularly bright and happy this morning. What's going on?
Maybe it's Friday, but I didn't have to travel as much this week. Might be that.
Could be, yes. And Julie, you're well?
Yes, very well. Thank you. Doing some great work at the moment. I'm really enjoying working with Yarra City at the moment.
Oh,
so,
okay.
yeah.
And there's a little story from Yarra in our story list today, if we get to it. I know I say this all the time, but there's been a lot. There's been a lot happening this week, but a couple of particularly big stories. Let's start with the Commonwealth Games, which will no longer be held in regional Victoria in 2026. And we want to concentrate a little bit on the implications here for councils, because a lot of councils, not just those regional hubs, were really gearing up for what those games were going to bring to regional Victoria. And I imagine, Tony, from a legal standpoint, there's probably some fairly serious discussions going on at the moment.
Yeah, I imagine that particularly those hub communities are looking at their what contractual arrangements they had in place with either the Commonwealth Games Authority or state government, what provisions in there might allow for some compensation potentially for, costs thrown away in terms of the games not proceeding. And that'll obviously turn on the level of certainty in those contracts and what avenues of compensation, if any, are set out in there. But I expect that there'll be a lot of analysis there, and there, as there will be. And how do you quantify?
Yeah.
Also, just the loss of what economic benefit there might have been in millions of viewers in India and Canada. In the UK, becoming aware of, a Ballarat, a Bendigo, a Shepparton, the Trove Valley, Geelong, etc. Through the coverage, the marathon was going to be in Ballarat, people in Cambridge or in Mumbai seeing, Sturt Street and Lake Wendouree as the marathon runners ran, and similarly, the trams in Bendigo and those sorts of things. So clearly a huge blow for those communities, regardless of the promise of some capital works funding from state government in terms of, completing some of those projects. And understandably, I think there'll be a lot of councils looking at their contractual arrangements and talking to their lawyers.
Yeah, so they've been fairly measured to this point. Obviously, they want to wait to see the detail. You're right. There's been promise of spending on housing, which has been a top of the list issue for councils for some time. The infrastructure that was going to be provided for the games, that all looks like still being provided. I'm not sure about timelines or whether to the extent that was promised. But just an interesting little wrinkle. I'll get your take on this in a moment, Julie. But Tony, what about those councils that aren't the hubs that might have made commitments? And I've heard of one that potentially has made commitments in good faith to build stuff because they're expecting flow-on effects, visitation, economic boost, etc. Do they have a leg to stand on in terms of compensation?
Well, unless there's a formal written contract, and there probably is unlikely to be one between those non-hub areas and the Commonwealth Games Authority or state government, then they'd be seeking to make out an oral contract. And that's, it's all about, would it be reasonable for them to, rely upon some sort of oral representations as enough of a certainty for them to then have taken steps that are, against their financial interest in this case. I would have thought that it's a much more difficult case for councils like that to make out. And but again, I think they'll look at their own individual circumstances, but probably a bit more problematic for them.
Yes, Julie, what's your take?
Well, Chris, I'm a little bit worried for the CEOs and the staff in particular about people that have been brought in to work on all of these projects that were promised and were going to be delivered. So one can only hope that those people that have been employed are now going to step across into still delivering these capital projects. I'm not too sure whether that was all of the staff that have been employed are going to be in that space to be able to do that. So I'm not really too sure whether it's going to have an impact on staff or staff losing their jobs as a result of it. So that's something that no doubt is of a real concern to the councils at this point in time.
You make a really good point, because some of those people were brought on in Commonwealth Games focused positions, weren't they?
That's right, yeah. So one can only assume that either they will be redeployed to somewhere else or that they will potentially lose their jobs. I suspect that most of those would be contract type positions.
Yeah.
Look, a real challenge for those councils in managing the staff outfall and managing the community outfall as well. The communities being so disappointed. We saw a report where there were communities in Bendigo that were gutted about, or devastated, I think they said, about the games being cancelled. So, look, I think lots of outfall. People will no doubt get over it over time. It's really good that the government are committing to improve infrastructure and housing. We know how much of a challenge housing is in regional Victoria. It needs a lot of injection of capital to build more housing, and it's really good to hear that that's still going to be going ahead. Although, did I hear that was going to be spread across regional Victoria, not necessarily only in those areas where it was
correct
promised?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's my understanding as well. And bodies like Rural Councils Victoria have come out and welcomed that. So I guess, as I've said on this show before, it's an ill wind that blows no good. That's some good that's coming for the broader community across the state. There'll be a bit more to be said about this. And of course, there's a lot being said about the reputational damage for Victoria, for Melbourne, etc. And of course, there's some politics playing out here as well, which we don't necessarily need to buy into, but we will keep an eye on the impact on councils as that becomes better understood.
There is a bit of a double standard here. I mean, if a council had this sort of enormous cost blowout, we'd almost have, calls for monitors to be coming in, and it just, it's pause for thought to say, state government, we can get beat up in our sector when costs blow out, and yet it seems to be very forgivable when it occurs. The state government's end, and there's a lot to play out here. There's a lot unknown about these costs. Hasn't been a whole lot of transparency, I'd have to say, on this, and there's a lot of questions that are unanswered, and it's probably not in the government's playbook at the moment to really reveal those figures. But if that was a local council community, we'd be having ministerial intervention, one would think.
You make an excellent point there, and I did see the mayor in the UK that led the Birmingham games saying that they managed to put it on for less than it cost the Gold Coast to put the previous Commonwealth Games on. And I think there's a bit of head scratching as to how that number of $6 or $7 billion has been arrived at.
Well, indeed, Paris in 2024 is running the Olympics, much bigger event, longer time frame, and the entire Paris event is a $5 billion Australian cost.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave that one there. The other, the big one that's just come out in the last 24 hours, and not surprising, I guess, is a last-ditch bid in the Victorian Court of Appeal by the property developer John Woodman to stop the release of the Operation Sandon report, which was flagged to be coming out next week and be released to Parliament. Tony, that's looking a bit unlikely now.
Yeah, so there's an appeal to the Victorian Court of Appeal from a recent Supreme Court decision. That appeal will be heard next Monday, on Monday the 24th. And the appeal from Mr. Woodman, it relates to this element, this 6 days of public hearings where he was examined in a public hearing. And his case is that that the public nature of that examination was a breach of Section 117 of the IBAC Act. Now, if that appeal is unsuccessful, there is still one other avenue of appeal, which is to seek leave to appeal to the High Court. So it's possible, probably likely, Mr. Woodman would attempt that. I don't know how much the High Court would entertain that prospect, but there is something to be considered here. I mean, the IBAC Act says that, generally speaking, these hearings are not held in public, and then there is a provision in Section 117 that says, unless IBAC decides that on reasonable grounds there are exceptional circumstances. Well, you could say, well, here the allegations of corruption, but I guess every single IBAC investigation involves that. That it's in the public interest, and I suppose there was an argument that it was in the public interest for this to be held publicly, but also that the public examination can be held without causing unreasonable damage to a person's, reputation, safety, or well-being. And that's the argument Mr. Woodman will be making. I think that Part C there, that there was unreasonable damage to his reputation. Right. So this wasn't a trial. We're not doing this is the investigation. So it's like, we don't get to come in and watch the police interrogate someone. So, and if you like, a whole bunch of Casey councillors, the Casey CEO, Glenn Patterson, all had to go through a public process. And when the report eventually comes out, if some of those people who are put through that process aren't recommended for criminal charges, then one would think that they might have an argument as to say, well, why was I put through that, that public process when others weren't? The Premier was not. The Premier was interviewed in private, and there were questions about, there were two different pieces of evidence given about whether he had Mr. Woodman's mobile phone number. So, I understand we're a bit frustrated with the delays here. I don't think there'd be many people coming out defending what appears to have been Mr. Woodman's behaviour from the allegations, but there's a principle here about should people's reputations sort of suffer in the public arena prior to, a formal, court hearing or trial.
I think that frustration you speak of is being felt all around, no doubt within IBAC as well, and certainly within the sector, Julie, which is really waiting to see what significant sort of changes for the way planning functions might be recommended or proposed out of this.
Correct, Chris. And look, we know that there were planning changes proposed before the election last year. They got put on hold. We're still waiting for this outcome because we do believe that it's going to have a big impact on the planning system and how planning operates, and potentially the controls that might be, or powers that might be taken away from councils as a result. So I think it's becoming really frustrating because the planning system needs review, it needs improvement, and I believe this is potentially holding that up. So we need to keep moving forward. We need to improve this system that is now getting, it's got old legislation, it's got, it's very, very complex. We know that not everybody's satisfied with the system and how it's working and would really like to see changes. Councils want to come to the table and discuss those changes with the state government as soon as possible and want to be party to that. But this is, this is a real problem that this report is not being released because this is going to, they're going to be some serious learnings, I think, out of this report that we do need to respond to.
All right. Well, I think we've all had probably a day freed up in our calendars next week because we were thinking we'd be combing this report and getting ready to dissect it here on TGU. That might not be happening just yet. We'll see what happens certainly on Monday, Tony, as you say. with that Court of Appeal process. Meanwhile, New South Wales, Tasmania are two states that are pushing forward with some pretty significant changes to the planning system, and we'll talk a bit about one of those at least a little later in the program. Tony, I want to congratulate you on your prescience, because you very recently said you don't think it would be too long before, with all these disruptions to council meetings, you see council requiring photo identification for anyone who wants to join a public gallery at a council meeting, which was sort of against that whole open principle that we've had for council meetings for many years. But Bendigo, for the rest of the year, has announced that it will require photo ID, and they're also changing their question time processes. I imagine you're not surprised, Tony.
No, I'm not. And let me say, I wouldn't be surprised if it became a permanent part of the, you know, the background here. I know that City of Whittlesea, in their revised governance rules, which are out for consultation, have a similar requirement. I think it's a sensible measure in terms of public safety, in terms of, you know, if you're going to then subsequently take action against people who have been disruptive or ban them from attending council venues, then you actually need to know who they are. Interestingly, I was talking to CEO at Whittlesea recently, Craig, and he said to me that just asking for ID can actually deter some of these elements out there that are coming to be disruptive. They actually don't want people to know their names. They actually have this fear of, you know, unreasonable fear of being monitored and tracked by ASIO and these sorts of organisations. And once you require ID from them, they often will decide not to attend the venue. But I do think it's a good move. I also saw that Greater Bendigo were introducing requirements around questions in writing in advance, which many councils already have for public question time. But I know this is something that council laws grapple with, and, you know, is it anti-democratic, less consultative, less transparent if we require questions to be submitted in writing, and you can't just, you know, have an open mic scenario on the night and wander up and ask a question? I actually think this is the right way to go. It leads to, you know, better prepared answers, less of this, you know, we'll take that on notice type answers, and also doesn't leave your CEO, your mayor, your governance officer in this invidious position on the night where they have to quickly make a decision. You know, is this question acceptable? Is it, you know, personal? Is it derogatory or defamatory? Or, you know, making those decisions on the run is a difficult thing to do. And I think the requirement to submit in advance in writing is a good move.
That balance in the public question time processes has been a challenge for a long time, really, between councillors who don't want to be seen to be shutting down that transparent aspect, officers who, for good reasons, want to manage it appropriately. I think it's gone very far one direction since the new Local Government Act with the transparency principle, and that's been relied on by a lot of people to say, hey, no, this needs to be a much more open and free-flowing process. But we're sort of paying for that now, Julie.
Yeah, that's what worries me, Chris. I mean, I'm a big fan of, you know, get the questions in advance and give the officers chance to be able to provide, you know, fulsome answers to these questions. That's still transparent. It's still read out in the public. It's the answers given in the public domain. So that, to me, is still transparent. It just is, it's respectful as well. And I just think it's a much smarter way of doing things. And it means that things are kept sort of more calm in the meeting and professional in the meeting. So I'm a I'm a big fan of that, and I agree with you. I think it's gone too much the other way, and there are now councillors and staff that are being targeted by angry residents that are, getting up and asking questions in a way that might, at the same time, be derogatory, at the same time, try and defame them. So, yeah.
And you don't see that happening at any other level of government, do you?
No, you don't.
No.
Very good point.
Okay, let's have a look at a couple of other stories that have made news this week. In a similar part of the world, Mount Alexander Shire has resolved to lobby the state government for a ban on commercial kangaroo shooting. It's not going down well with farmers, apparently, but that's the position the council's arrived at. Tony, your reaction to this?
Yeah, look, I understand that it follows a resident petition that Mount Alexander Shire has received, and that, farmers can still, apply for a harvesting or apply for a permit, at least, to manage populations. And that's a authority to control wildlife type permit that's always been available.
It's just the commercial aspect, I think, the council's come out against, isn't it?
Look, my view is that and the reality is that there are places in Victoria, I think I probably live in one, where there's an overpopulation of kangaroos, such that they're, moving into areas where it's they're coming into direct contact with people, with heavy vehicles, with trucks, and in fact some of them are struggling to find feed. So there does seem to be a humane and defensible reason why there needs to be some euthanizing in some areas. To me, once that's going to occur, I think, well, why wouldn't you get some commercial value out of that in terms of the harvesting, rather than just digging a big hole and essentially, burying the carcasses in a hole. But, the mover of the motion, Councillor Stephen Gardner at Mount Alexander, described, saying it was going to be a war zone, 65,000 kangaroos apparently earmarked for euthanizing in Mount Alexander Shire. But I'm if that's still going to go ahead, then I don't quite see the rationale for us, not putting those carcasses to some, use.
Yeah, and a motive issue, no doubt. And I'm yet to see any sort of state government response to that position that the council has reached. Another council calling for a ban, or in fact implementing a ban, and you talked about Yarra, Julie, where you're doing some work. They've announced this week that they will ban fossil fuel advertising on all council-owned properties, and that'll be phased in as current agreements expire. This is apparently a move towards lowering those emissions and meeting targets by, I think it was 2035.
That's right, Chris, and they're really serious at Yarra about these types of issues. So I'm not surprised to see this. Yarra do often take a lead on these kind of matters. So look, if that's what the council are wanting to do, that's where their drivers' ambitions are, then that's great. I know there's some great planning work going on with a number of councils in this space, so it'll be interesting to see that unfold. But yeah, look, not surprising to see, and we're going to see more of this, I think, across all councils in the sector.
I saw also this week, and I haven't put this one in the story list, folks, sorry about that, but Waverley Council in Sydney, there's a ban there come into effect on gas cooking and gas heating, I think it is, in new residential developments, which has been attacked this week by certain politicians and other groups as virtue signalling. There's a pile of stories, if you were to print them this high on my desk, of things that councils ban. And then, there's been a few to add to that file this week.
It always amazes me. We go from kangaroos to fossil fuels in one jump of a segment in TGU. It just goes to show how much councils have to get involved in such complex and such a variety of issues across the community.
Tony? I was going to say, I'd make a distinction. I think what Yarra are doing here is absolutely, defensible. It's something that they're entitled to do. It's the council's buildings, and the council's entitled, just as they are to control who enters the buildings and under what terms. what commercial advertising occurs at those venues, and so in this case it's against fossil fuels. We know that there's certain bans on cigarette advertising, but that might be something similar that they might, for example, not have at council venues. In terms of the gas appliances, that would have an interface with state planning laws, state building code provisions, and then you take another step further, say declaring an area a nuclear-free zone when maybe there's no defence facilities, maybe there's no port, and in fact,
Marybeck's done that.
Yeah, and in fact, maybe not maybe. In fact, the council has no direct role in the provision of defence services. To me, that's a much longer bow to draw. But I think what Yarra's doing here is just a very practical way, and it will have real implications. It's more than a virtue signal. It'll actually have real implications for what form of advertising occurs on those council buildings, and good luck to them.
All right, let's move on to a couple of we'll call them personnel matters. Strathbogie Shire held a countback, or the VEC held a countback for the Shire last week to fill an extraordinary vacancy. We reported that Paul Ayton had won that election. It now turns out that Paul did not return his eligibility declaration. I'm presuming that means he did not wish to take up the position, and therefore Robin Weatherald has now been elected to Strathbogie Shire in the Lake Ngambie ward by virtue of being the last standing candidate from the October 2020 election. I'm not sure how many times we've seen that, Tony. Or
what it means is this: if there's another extraordinary vacancy, there ain't going to be a countback. There's going to have to be a by-election, isn't there? Yeah. So that is pretty extraordinary that's come down to that. But I think Robin is a former councillor.
Correct.
And retired business person. So presumably will be able to skill up very quickly once again in terms of that councillor role.
Long-term, well-known businessman in the region before retiring, I believe. And in another personnel matter, Julie, down at Bass Coast, where Ali Wasty is moving on to Greater Geelong she leaves Bass Coast at the end of this month. I think takes up the role at Greater Geelong in August. The council has decided to share the interim CEO duties among 3 of its general managers.
That's right, they have, which is a very nice and generous thing for the council to do, to give them all a go. So we're talking about Greg Box, the General Manager, Partnerships, Economy and Culture. He will be interim between July and September. Then James Sturton, the General Manager, Placemaking, will take over from September to November. And then Jodie Kennedy will come in, the General Manager of Resilient Communities, will come in from November to January. And in the meantime, they'll run their recruitment process. So a very nice opportunity for those 3 very talented people down at Bass Coast to be able to keep the ship afloat during that recruitment period. So well done to them.
And I think what's sensible about that too, not just the opportunity to give those general managers that exposure to the CEO role, they've actually flagged that they recognise it's going to be probably a 6-month process and run into Christmas, New Year. So often you see councils say, we can probably fill this role in 3 or 4 months and only make shorter term arrangements, don't they? So that sounds like pretty practical solution to me, given that the recruitment process, I believe, hasn't started yet.
Absolutely. I think it's a smart move on all counts, and it gives, for each of those 3 senior executives, it gives them a great opportunity just in terms of personal development and improvement, and leaves the council ultimately, whether it chooses one of these acting CEOs to be the permanent CEO or not, it gives them a more highly experienced group of senior staff. So I think it's a great move, and congrats to them. I've worked with James Sturton a lot over the years through Banyule and into Bass Coast and have dealt with Jody before, but they are both, highly regarded, or three highly regarded individuals.
Well done. Takes three people to fill the shoes of Ali Wasty is the other message that comes out of that. Let's move to some interstate stories that are worth noting. Big news down in Tasmania on the weekend when the Premier came out and said, we will not force councils to amalgamate. This was turning into a very emotive issue with lots of smaller councils and their mayors expressing great concerns about what was likely coming out of this local government review board process. Doesn't mean there won't be any amalgamations, but they won't be forced. So I don't know whether either of you wish to comment on that.
I reckon it means there won't be any, Chris. I reckon it's a big call for them to volunteer. There might be one or two, but there's a political reality here in Tassie. It's a minority government now. You have two former Liberals who are independents who were against the amalgamations. The state government there, Jeremy Rockcliffe, relies on those independents to stay in office. There's been, as you say, that backlash from those, particularly those rural areas that traditionally are Liberal. But the implications, what it means is that Tassie's only less than 600,000 people continues to be governed by 29 local government authorities. We continue to have that dilemma of how do you find 29 directors of corporate services amongst 600,000 people, 29 directors of infrastructure, chief financial officers, I could go on. It's not going to change that sort of crisis that continues there, and maybe can's been kicked down the road for another day, another government with a stronger political base.
And it's interesting, Chris, isn't it? Because which council would be prepared to have a council resolution to amalgamate?
The bigger ones. Yeah. So Launceston, for example, I think has said amalgamations aren't off the table for it. But as Tony says, which smaller councils are now going to agree to be subsumed into a bigger?
That's right, because that means that they will lose their power. And there might be some communities that think that this is a good idea. But then some communities that then would say, well, maybe this is not such a good idea, because if we merge into Launceston, is there going to be the same level of service for our small community that there has been previously? So I just don't know whether it's going to happen in reality. I just have my doubts.
No, I think you're both right now, and a similar thing's playing out in New Zealand, where they've done a review there, but also the minister has apparently said he won't be forcing councils to join together. So, as one of our correspondents on the Roundup said, that pretty much means it won't happen. Directly elected mayors, something we don't have much of in Victoria. There's a bit more of it in New South Wales, and there might be one more council having a directly elected mayor. Kiama has resolved this week to put a referendum to its community with next year's elections, and it'll be the last one in its region to not have a directly elected mayor unless that gets up. Is that something we should be looking at again in Victoria, do you think, folks? I mean, we've got it for Melbourne. We had it for Geelong. That, of course, didn't go that well, history would suggest.
Look, it's interesting. I think the arguments, there's that the argument for it is there's a continuity of leadership. You've got a mayor for the entire term of council. There is, that sort of first among equals, if you like, and typically, if you know that there's a direct election of mayor, you can actually give the mayor some stronger powers. They've actually got a sort of a democratic mandate for that, and it's that sense of avoiding, backroom deals on, who's getting the mayoralty, whose turn is it this time around. It does create some issues, though, particularly the way they do it in New South Wales. The mayor won't necessarily be in the majority. If you, so you can have a scenario where you're the mayor and you have the majority of councillors trying to take council in another direction, which is problematic. One way they sort of solve that in New South Wales, which they don't do in Victoria, is that you can run for mayor. You can be a candidate for mayor and a candidate for council at the same time.
Ah.
So you don't have to actually decide which one. And so let's say you get enough votes to be mayor, the votes that you got to be a councillor go to your second preference, right?
Wow.
On your
Okay.
ticket. So you get this bonus seat scenario. So I run for mayor and I run for councillor. I get up as mayor, and my second, the other person in my ticket who presumably agrees with everything I do or my policies gets on as mayor on my votes. So my votes directly translate through. That doesn't happen in Victoria. Sally Capp didn't run, as generally as a councillor, although she was on a broader ticket with other councillors. She was running purely for mayor. So, there's a few nuances there. I think it works well in the big capital cities. I don't know whether the small sort of regions need someone on a sort of a higher podium.
Interesting. Thanks for that. You've done some homework there, Tony. I wasn't aware of those intricacies of the system. I want to ask you both a question without notice. Are you hearing much about the use of AI in local government? I know you talk to a lot of teams around the state. Julie, is AI becoming a thing, or is it a sleeper still?
No, it's not a lot. There's not a lot of discussion that I've had with teams around this yet. So I'm a bit surprised. I thought that they might be hooking into this a bit more. But no, not a lot of discussion at the moment, but I'm sure there's a lot of thinking in that space.
Yeah, so it's one to keep an eye on. I'm not sure whether there's any sort of legal questions about it thus far, Tony.
Yeah, well, not so much with local government, but I can say there certainly are around Chat GPT. There's in fact cases where there's a case where a lawyer's gone in not in Australia, but a lawyer's gone into a courtroom, having typed into Chat GPT, what are the best arguments for my case here? Of course, Chat GPT just relies upon what's out there on the internet. It doesn't have to actually be true.
Or current.
News for people, some of the stuff on the internet isn't true.
Oh, Tony, you're shattering our illusion.
No, now you're
aliens aren't in the White House. But
we need to tell our children that.
Are you sure about that last one?
Yeah, I know. So this lawyer walked in and cited these imaginary cases for his client, and subsequently someone went to look them up, or the court said, can we have the reports, and found that they didn't exist, and he got done for professional misconduct. But there might be some comms managers out there who are like, we've got to there's a speech someone has to give, I need to write a speech, I'll type that into Chat GPT and see what comes out. But I think that particular platform's useful where you already know a fair bit about the field, and you can filter the rubbish as well. But I think you were going to tell us about a story in the city of Stirling.
Yeah, I was, and it's something I've been thinking about, because I am seeing more examples around the sector where AI is starting to be put to good use. And AI is more than just ChatGPT. There's many AI tools that are now starting to proliferate. We talked, I think, about the virtual fencing trial in Townsville, which uses AI modelling. This week, the city of Stirling in Western Australia has launched an AI-based engagement platform where you go along to infrastructure sites, 42 of them, and and there's a QR code, and you can have a two-way conversation with an AI bot, I want to call it, via that system, about the way you use those facilities and what you'd like to see and what you don't like, etc. All of this is being gathered automatically through the AI system as inputs to the city's new community infrastructure plan. And I'm going to talk to the mayor of Stirling about it next week for the roundup, actually. I just think it's an emerging example of how AI can actually be used to streamline some processes without actually necessarily putting anybody's job at risk, making their job easier, in fact. What do you make of that?
I think it's really interesting. And, I'd love to, I'm looking forward to hearing what the mayor says about it, because I think that what it enables is people who are, maybe in a different demographic, might be able to relate to this a little bit better and have a bit of fun with it, to give their views across. It'll be interesting to see what the demographic is that uses it, and, you know, providing their views. And then, you know, would be interesting to see what the council does with that information. There's also that sort of faceless person of council that you're sending messages to. Would it be used potentially to say things that might be a little less appropriate, or to abuse the council? I don't know, but you know, when you're not having to face a person, you know, you could say all sorts of things via this avenue. So I don't know. Look, it'd be interesting to see what the mayor has to say and how they actually use it. But I am very excited about councils using this kind of technology to find a different way of being able to engage different people in the community.
And this platform's called Ainslie, AINSLEY. So there you go. I just thought that was interesting. Glad you too. Let's move to the picks of the week before we run out of time here. Julie, I hinted that you wanted to talk about planning in Tasmania because hot on the heels of the Premier there ruling out forced amalgamations, he has announced legislation to, he says, take the politics out of planning. This has not gone down well with councils because it's going to take some of their planning responsibilities away from them.
Yeah, and this is what we were thinking was going to potentially happen in Victoria, particularly post the IBAC release of the IBAC report. So yes, the Premier and the Acting Minister for Planning have actually come out and said that they want to take the politics out of planning decisions, and they want to do that in a bid to improve the certainty and transparency and the effectiveness of planning in the state, which was interesting comments, really, I think. So they were set to introduce new legislation to allow for some planning decisions to be made by independent expert DAPs, development assessment panels. That's what.
Are these for major developments, Julie? Are they for particular types of developments?
Yeah. So what they're doing is they're looking at different types and scale of projects that would be eligible. They're looking at including housing, social housing, large-scale developments, and other proposals of community interest, which is interesting.
That's a bit broad.
Well, it is a bit broad. So there could be a lot that's captured in all of this. And then they're talking about potentially projects valued over $10 million in urban centres and over $5 million in rural areas. And as we know, in urban centres, it's not hard to find a development that's over $10 million at this point in time. So look, they're saying that they're going to put draft legislation out for consultation later this year, Chris. With a view of it being introduced into Parliament in early 2024. So look, I think, as you know, there have been discussions and speculation with the Victorian government. I think no doubt the Victorian government will be looking at this and seeing what comes out of the consultation, how it goes down with the councils, but I'm sure the councils would not be happy about this. If you think about it, the biggest power that councils have at the moment in Victoria and as well in Tasmania would be planning decisions. That is a very, very powerful role that the council plays at the moment. So to have that taken away from them, that will feel like a major shift of power back to, away from councils. So I'm going to watch this one closely, Chris, and keep an eye on what's happening locally as well. Yeah.
Good. Keep us updated. I noticed one mayor has said the system is not broken. It's working as it's meant to, and I'm sure there'll be more of that feedback. Tony, you've spotted a story out of Western Australia where a council's racking up some legal bills, taking action against people for comments on social media.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think it's an interesting sort of case study for communications managers and CEOs here in Victoria. It's the Shire of Dundas. Dundas is covers Norseman to Eucla, so that Nullarbor region, very low population, less than 700 people in the entire Shire. There's been I would say a fairly negative ABC News story on council spending apparently $4,500 on lawyers drafting at least 3 cease and desist letters to residents over critical social media comments. So, the Shire says that the letters follow about 4 years of insults on social media being received by the Shire president and the CEO particularly, but saying that they were, defaming. But, just in terms of the case study for, us here, shows, perhaps sometimes responding in, to negative social media commentary can actually kind of escalate the situation. In this case, the article wasn't particularly, favourable towards the council. A lot of questions being asked. The individuals who received the letters were all quoted as saying, no, they are not going to withdraw and bring it on. But there is some controversy in this Shire, I think, particularly around the closure of a local GP clinic. Where council didn't sort of step in and introduce some additional funding for a locum. And there's been a lot of negative publicity. Council's been blamed for the outcome there. But yeah, pause for thought for us here in Victoria when we think, will we send out some cease and desist type letters to people who are commenting negatively social media? Well, that might create a story in itself that actually brings more attention to the matter.
Yes, and I don't think the story reveals what the comments were, but there's some suggestion of defamatory statements and less than savoury sort of content. So I guess you need the whole story, don't you?
And the council haven't been supported by the state government in this either. The state government have come out and sort of said, well, is this a really good use of public spend, it's really gone against them.
All right, one more before we wrap up. I want to pick a story out of Hong Kong, where you may or may not be aware that smoking is banned in large parts of the city, but people have been ignoring that ban. And a city official this week came out with a rather extraordinary request of residents to tackle this problem by giving those people who light up where they shouldn't the Hong Kong stare. So I just want to test this with you, Tony. If one of us lit up, that's pretty. Could you hold that for a few minutes, do you think? And
no, is it intimidating you? Or
no, it's not. No. Julie, can you do any better than that? Yes. No, that would work. All right, maybe he's on.
That's Julie Bishop there.
That's the mum not happy look.
Yeah, maybe he's onto something. I wouldn't be able to keep a straight face, but we'll pop a link to that.
We should send Julie Bishop across to Hong Kong. Remember that stare in the Parliament? Remember the
yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Hong Kong used to be one of my favourite places. I'm not so keen to visit anymore. I might do something that gets me stared at. Not smoking. I'm not a smoker.
Or locked up.
All locked up, yes. All right, heaven forbid. All right, let's bring this to a close. Thank you very much, as always, for your insights. We've covered a lot of ground, as usual. Thank you to our audience for the feedback and for continuing to watch and listen to our great shock and delight, I must say. Tony, thank you, and have a great week ahead.
Will do. Thank you again.
And thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Tony. Great to see you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Julie Reid and Tony Raunic from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, of course, our terrific sponsors for TGU. For those of you who keep asking, that stands for the Governance Update. And we'll be back again next Friday to talk about all the news from around the sector. Until then, thanks for watching and listening, and bye for now.